Hey everybody, and welcome to the Getting Started section of this course. In this section, I'll be running you through all of the gear that you will need to get started shooting and giving you my personal recommendations. I've spent hundreds of hours using and researching loads of gear. I've also spent a lot of money on gear myself, all so I can give you the best recommendations and hopefully save you some money in the process. Now in this part, we're going to be looking solely at cameras. What to look for depends on your budget and what you will be shooting. If you're brand new to videography, then this part can be quite overwhelming, but if you've already bought a camera and you may just want to know what to look for when upgrading to your next one. So there are several things to look for when buying a camera. First, I would say price. Now if you have a limited budget, I would recommend getting something along the lines of a Canon 750D or a 5D. These are capable of shooting great 1080p footage and won't cost you an arm and a leg. If you're on a bigger budget, you can't go wrong with a Canon 5D Mark IV or a Sony a7 III. These are about £1,500-ish. If you're on a higher budget, then I would strongly suggest the Canon 1DX Mark II. These secondhand will set you back about £2,500, and if money is no concern, then I would recommend the pinnacle of cinema cameras, and in my opinion, go for a Red. Now don't let any of that put you off though. Buy secondhand. There's absolutely nothing wrong with buying secondhand. Practically all of my kit was secondhand at one point, but it's much better to have a good quality secondhand camera than have a brand new expensive camera and not know how to use it. And also don't be afraid to shop around. eBay is a great way to get some cheap kit which will keep its value really well. There's no problem buying secondhand cameras to get to grips with and then upgrading your kit later down the line. Remember this, a lot of clients won't care what you shoot with, but they will care about what the end product looks like. So you could be a beginner with a Red camera and struggle to create something better than a pro with a £600 camera. Learn now, build later. Next is frame rates. Frame rates are measured in FPS or frames per second, so this is the amount of still images taken in 1 second to create a motion image. The standard these days is 25 frames per second, which is closest to what the human eye can see. So things like motion blur look more natural in 25 frames per second than they do in 50. Here's an example of 25 versus 50, and you'll notice that the motion blur on the 25 frames per second image is a lot smoother and less jittery than the one on the 50. The standard for the majority of film or TV work is 25 or 23.976 frames per second if you're being specific. Now each time you look at a camera online there will be a huge spec sheet. One of the key specs that you will see is the frame rate. Generally you will see 60 or 30 frames per second. In the UK, the frame rate will be 25 or 50 frames per second as we use PAL or phase alternating line for our electricity transmission, which runs at 50 Hz, whereas in the US or other countries you may see NTSC or National Television Standards Committee, which runs at 60 Hz. Now this might seem completely unrelated to video, but it does matter. If you imagine the refresh rate of electricity is 50 times per second and you shoot with a 60 frame per second frame rate, then they will be out of sync. Look at this example of the clock on my oven. Shooting this at 60 frames per second shows an obvious mismatch, leading to the clock appearing to strobe. Whereas because I'm in the UK, if I match the frames per second with the hertz of the clock and shoot in 50, then there is no strobe at all. Looking at these side by side really shows you the difference. Now this is just a clock, but it's the same with any electrical item, so lights may also strobe if they're out of sync. There is a workaround for this where you can change the shutter speed to match, but we will cover that in the technical part of this course. Frames per second simply allows you to slow down the image to create a super smooth slow motion shot. Let's say for example you shoot an image at 100 frames per second, which is 100 frames or images per second, and then slow it down by 75%. This then gives you 25 frames or images per second. But because there are 75 images also within that shot, they sit between the other 25 images, creating a slow motion shot. If you took a 50 frames per second image and slowed it down by 50% to give you 25 frames per second, the slow motion isn't as good and as smooth as there are less images to fit in, but it is still slow motion. Now if you take a 25 frames per second image and slow it down, you can see it's jittery as there's no other images to essentially fit between those 25 frames. For example, let's take the same image, shot in 25 frames, 50 frames and 100 frames per second, and look at the difference if we play them all back in 25 frames per second. You can see that the 100 frames per second image is a lot smoother and buttery than the 50 frames, and well, you can't really slow down a 25 frames per second clip if you want it to look good. In short, if you want a smoother or slower shot, shoot in a higher frame rate. Next is sensor size. The sensor is the part of the camera that captures the light and turns it into an image. Generally, the bigger the sensor, the more light it lets in, so this means you can shoot in lower light with better results. The sensor size also contributes to the overall image quality, so the bigger the sensor, generally the better the image quality. Let's have a look at an example of some sensor sizes. Firstly, you have full frame. These are the biggest sensors available on digital cameras such as the 1DX Mark II or the Sony a7 III. Next you have APS-C, which you'll find on some smaller and cheaper cameras like the Canon 250D and 750D. Micro Four Thirds sensors appear in some of the Panasonic cameras, and iPhone and drone sensors are even smaller than that. So you should always try and get a better sensor if you can, as this will make the overall image look better. For example, if you shoot 4K on the 1DX versus 4K on an iPhone, even though there is the same amount of pixels, the pixels in the 1DX are bigger due to the bigger sensor and therefore less compressed, so your image will be less compressed too. So it's key to remember that 4K isn't always the same. Yes, there's the same amount of pixels, but they're smaller on smaller sensors and therefore they may show in the image quality. You should also look out for crop factors. A crop factor is simply the image crop due to the size of the sensor. So here's a picture shot on my full frame camera at 50mm, and here's the same picture shot on the APS-C camera at 50mm also. But as the APS-C sensor is 1.6 times smaller than the full frame, the image also appears 1.6 times more zoomed in. So the image taken on the APS-C camera looks more like it was shot on an 80mm lens rather than 50, which is simply 50mm times by 1.6. This would mean that when you're buying lenses, you would need to compensate for the crop factor. For example, if you wanted to get a 50mm equivalent on an APS-C camera, you would need to look at buying a 30mm lens, because 30 times 1.6 equals 50. Number 4 is low light capability. Low light capability is another key factor to consider when looking at cameras. This is simply how well the camera performs in low light conditions. Generally, the sensor size and lens choice determines how well a camera performs in low light. Like I mentioned earlier, the bigger the sensor, the more light enters. Pair this with a fast or low aperture lens and you have a ton of light entering the camera. This is ideal when you want to keep your ISO low and your performance high. Boosting ISO is one way to brighten up a dark image, but this will lead to noise in the image. Alternatively, using artificial lights helps too, but there will be some scenarios using a super fast lens, then your camera will need to let a lot of light in. Number 5 is image resolution. So you've heard the terms 720p, 1080p, 4K, 8K, etc. before, but what does it all mean? Why is image resolution important? Image resolution is the amount of pixels that are displayed within an image. When TVs first became a thing, 720p was standard definition. This meant that an image was 1280 pixels wide and 720 high. 1080p is 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels high. A 4K image is about 4000 pixels wide and 2180 pixels high. Now, more pixels gives you more information and more data in the image. This generally means that the image is sharper and retains detail when viewed on a bigger monitor or a screen. If you were to stretch a 720p shot onto a 4K TV, it wouldn't look great. Now, most cameras have the ability to shoot in 4K nowadays, but it's certainly something to look out for. This is one of the reasons why I love the Canon 1DX Mark II, as it shoots in 4K 25 frames per second and also 4K 50. Generally, there will be a trade-off between frame rate and resolution, so I would recommend finding a camera that shoots at least 1080p 60 frames per second. Number 6 is lens choice. Future-proofing your investment is a key buying factor, as you won't want to spend £2,000 to £3,000 on a camera to find that your lenses aren't compatible with any other cameras. This unfortunately did happen to me. I used the 250D, which was compatible with EF and EF-S lenses, invested in some more EFS lenses, and then once I upgraded to the 1DX, which is not compatible with EFS lenses, it forced me to invest in more EF lenses. Now, you can buy adapters for lenses which allow you to put the likes of Canon lenses on Sony cameras, but as there are limited or no electronic parts in the adapters, you may lose important features like autofocus, so make sure this is something you consider. Another key thing to look out for is weather sealing. Your camera needs to be usable in all sorts of scenarios, so there are going to be times when you're shooting outside and it starts to rain, or there will be times when you want to shoot in the snow or the sand. You need to ensure the camera can deal with these scenarios. I learned this the hard way when I was shooting on the 250D once, which isn't weather sealed at all. It started to rain and I had no choice but to carry on shooting. When I took the footage back home and grabbed my SD card, I found there was water in the SD port. Luckily, there was no lasting damage, but water had got into the camera during the day, which could have been absolutely catastrophic if it had damaged the internals or if it had damaged the SD card. Finally, and this should be one of the main things you consider, is autofocus. There are plenty of cameras that offer good autofocus, but at the same time, there are a lot that don't. Higher end cinema cameras are manual focus only, as on set, it's usually someone's sole job to pull focus. One of the main reasons I use Canon is due to the dual pixel autofocus. Canon's autofocus is known for being super fast and keeping your subjects in focus. This is great as a one-man band, as you can be sure that with things such as dual pixel autofocus, flexi-zone and servo, that your subjects will constantly be in focus when you're shooting. So just to recap, the 8 things you should look for when buying a camera are price, frame rates, sensor size, low light capability, image resolution, lens choice, weather sealing, and autofocus. That's it for now, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.